Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's a real challenge if you're building custom ML hardware on FPGAs using high-level synthesis.
Yeah, how do you actually see what's happening inside? It's not like a CPU or GPU.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Profiling execution on these, really adaptable architectures is way trickier. So we're digging into a fascinating paper from Northwestern University.
It's called SPRING, Systematic Profiling of Randomly Interconnected Neural Networks Generated by HLS by Rui Shi and Seto Agrenchi.
And the core idea, just for a quick snapshot.
Well, they've come up with this novel, systematic way to profile HLS streaming accelerators on FPGAs. Instead of grabbing signals one by one, they propose this parallel profiling stream.
A profiling stream?
Yeah, think of it like a shadow stream flowing right alongside your actual data. It splits, it merges, all synchronized, and it's carrying info about internal stuff like how full the FIFOs are getting.
Okay, like little buffers inside the chip.
Exactly. And then all that monitoring info gets sent over to the processing system side for analysis. They showed it works really well on these randomly interconnected neural networks, or RNNs, that they built, using HLS-4 Melinid and Vitas HLS.
Right, and this really matters because the current tools, well, they often involve a ton of manual work, right? And they don't scale well if you want to watch lots of things at once.
Precisely. This research offers a much more automated, systematic path. It's potentially a game changer for real-time analysis, especially for these streaming architectures you see a lot in ML accelerators.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack this whole profiling stream idea. We'll look at how it plugs into HLS-4 Melinid for these RINNs, what it costs in resources, how they validated it.
And they found some really interesting patterns in FIFO sizing too, depending on how the networks were set up. Lots to cover.
Definitely. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it. Maybe start by contrasting this new idea with, how things usually work.
Good idea. So paint us a picture of the old way. Before Spring, what were engineers up against?
Okay, so traditionally, if you wanted to see a signal deep inside your FPGA design, you often had to, manually route it out to an external pin.
Physically wire it out.
Yeah, and then hook up a logic analyzer or something. Or another common way was using up precious on-chip memory, like a block RAM, a BRAM.
To just store the signal value.
Right, store the history of the signal. And then you have to stop everything or figure out how to dump that data off the chip for analysis later. Vendor tools like AMD's ILA core exist, but they still often need quite a bit of manual setup for each signal.
You mentioned FIFOs earlier, those first in, first out buffers. They're key for streaming, right? Making sure data flows smoothly between processing blocks.
Absolutely critical. And trying to monitor those or any internal signal with the old methods had big drawbacks.
Like what?
Well, the manual effort just explodes as designs get complex. You want to watch hundreds of signals, forget it. You physically run out of pins on the chip.
And the
finite resource. You can't just dedicate a BRAM to every little signal you're curious about.
Yeah.
And maybe the biggest issue, especially for streaming data flow where things happen in parallel.
Yeah.
Trying to piece together the big picture from all these individually captured signals. It's incredibly hard to correlate everything and understand the system dynamics, like trying to get a symphony by just hearing one violin then one flute separately.
Okay, yeah, that sounds messy and just doesn't scale. So how does this profiling stream concept, flip the script? What's the core innovation?
The really clever bit is creating this dedicated stream of profiling info that travels right alongside your actual data stream in parallel.
Okay.
So instead of pulling out single signals, they generate this whole other stream carrying metadata. In their case, it was mostly about FIFO fullness, using the built-in size function you often have in HLS.
So metadata about the FIFOs travels with the data that's going through those FIFOs.
Exactly. And it maintains that connection. When the data stream splits, maybe duplicated for parallel processing, the profiling stream splits too. When data streams merge back together, the profiling streams merge.
Huh. And where does this profiling stream end up?
It gets routed out to the processing system, the PS side of the SoC FPGA. So the software running on the ARM core, for example, can grab this stream and analyze it, potentially in real time.
So it's like attaching a little sidecar full of diagnostic info to your main data bus, and it just follows along.
That's a great analogy. And the kicker is they automated embedding this whole thing into the HLS-4 Melinid framework.
Ah, this is not manual insertion.
Nope. They built what they call a one-click system, generate the RNN, run their tool, and it instruments the HLS code, generates the hardware with profiling, and sets up the data collection. Drastically less manual work. Figure 2 in the paper has a nice visual comparing the old way, tapping individual lines versus their sort of parallel monitoring network.
That automation is key. Okay, let's get technical. This profiling stream carries metadata. How does that actually work? What's in the stream, and how does it handle those splits and merges you mentioned?
Sure. So as the main data flows through a module, say a convolutional layer implemented in HLS, the profiling stream also enters that module.
Right.
Inside, the profiling logic first reads the incoming profiling data from whatever came before it. Then it does the actual monitoring, like calling that size function on the output FIFO of the current module.
Okay, gets the current fill level.
Yep. And that new value, that FIFO size, gets appended to the profiling stream as it leaves the module. So the stream grows, accumulating this history of monitored values as it goes through the pipeline. Listing 1 shows a simple example function doing this.
Okay, that makes sense for a linear flow. But what about those splits? Data goes 2 ways.
Right, that's where it gets clever. Let's say you have a clone function. One data stream becomes 2 identical ones. The current profiling stream's content goes out with the first data stream. For the second and any subsequent data stream created by the split, its new profiling stream starts with a special placeholder value.
A placeholder. Why?
It basically signifies, okay, data went down this path, but the monitoring for this specific branch hasn't happened yet. It keeps the structure aligned.
Got it. So you know which branch is which later on, and merges when parallel paths come back together.
So in a merge, where multiple input streams combine into one output, the profiling streams are handled sequentially.
Sequentially? How?
The profiling stream corresponding to the first input data stream that gets processed in the merge. Its contents are read and written to the start of the output profiling stream. Then the profiler waits for the second input stream, reads its profiling data, and appends that to the output stream.
Ah, so the order reflects the merge order.
Exactly. Listing 2 in the paper, which shows some synthesized HDL code, hints at this. You see this extra state machine logic managing the writing of both data and profiling info. They do mention this can sometimes cause subtle interactions, which is interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like managing these streams could get pretty complex in really deep or, heavily branched networks. Did they talk about optimizing this?
They did touch on a couple of ideas. One is balancing the lengths of profiling streams after a split. If one path is much shorter, its profiling stream is shorter, which could be inefficient at the merge point. So maybe padding shorter streams.
Okay.
Another idea is creating shortcuts. If a profiling stream just passes through many stages without any monitoring happening in those stages, maybe you could forward it directly to the eventual merge point.
Bypass the intermediate hops.
Right, and just insert a placeholder where it would have been. Could save resources, potentially.
Makes sense. And once you have this potentially very long stream of profiling numbers back on the host computer, how do you know what's what? Which number belongs to which FIFO?
That's where the automation helps again. Because their framework is integrated with HLS-4 emulator, it knows the network structure and where it inserted the profiling logic.
So it generates a map.
It's essentially, yes. It generates a predetermined output profiling label list. This list tells you exactly which segment of the final output stream corresponds to which monitored signal. So you get the stream, look at the list, and go, okay, the first 10 values are FIFO A, the next 10 are FIFO B, and so on. Makes analysis much easier.
Very neat. Okay, let's talk about the test case. These randomly interconnected neural networks, RINNs. Why pick something so random?
Good question. RNNs are interesting precisely because they're complex and irregular. Unlike standard layered networks, their connections are, random.
Meaning it's hard to predict bottlenecks.
Exactly. You can't just look at the graph and easily guess where data might back up. You really need to profile them to understand the data flow. And their customizable nature makes them a great stress test for the profiling framework's flexibility. If it works on these messy structures, it should handle more regular ones too.
And how did they actually create these RINNs? What tools were involved?
They built on some prior work on RNN generation, but crucially, they plugged it right into HLS-4 emulator.
The high-level synthesis tool for ML.
Yep. And then they used AMD's Vitas HLS to go from the HLS code generated by HLS-4 emulator to actual hardware for their target FPGAs. The key was automating this whole chain generate RINN, instrument with Spring, synthesize with Vitas, run on FPGA, collect data.
They mentioned a specific Carous model structure they used as a base.
Right, for consistency in experiments.
Right.
It was inspired by earlier work. It took a 16-element input aiming for a 5-element output, kind of like a simplified MNES task.
Okay.
It started with a dense layer, then reshaped the output into a 2D grid, like an image with one channel, X1. Then came the core and part, stacking multiple conv 2D layers, all the same shape, but with random connections between them.
So the randomness was in how those conv layers were wired up.
Primarily, yes. Then flatten it back to 1D and a final dense layer with sigmoid activation to get the 5 outputs. Figure 5 shows some examples of the kinds of structures they could generate.
And they didn't just use convillers, right? They tried simpler building blocks, too.
Correct. They also built RNNs using just dense layers plus things like concatenation, element-wise, add, ReLU, and sigmoid activations.
And what did they find with those?
Interestingly, for those simpler RNNs, both co-simulation and their hardware profiling showed very small FIFO sizes, like max size 0 in COSIM, and never bigger than 1 on the actual FPGA.
Wow, quite different from the ConMet results.
Totally. It really drives home that the type of layer and how HLS implements it massively impacts buffering needs.
Okay, so they have this whole automated flow. Generate RN, profile it, synthesize it, run it on an RM-SUV FPGA like a PYNQ or ZCU102. Can you walk us through that flow again? Figure 1 illustrates it.
Exactly. Figure 1 shows it nicely. Starts with the RNN generation script. Then their extended HLS formula kicks in.
What were the key extensions to HLS formulae they made?
2 main things. First, better support for arbitrary numbers of inputs and outputs on those clone and merge functions, which you need for complex profiling paths. Second, tighter integration with Vitas HLS, specifically for SoC FPGAs, and the PYNQ software framework that runs on the processor.
So making HLS formally more aware of these specific profiling needs and target platforms?
Pretty much. After HLS formally generates the basic HLS project, their Spring framework parses the network, figures out which layers to profile, including splits and merges, and inserts the profiling logic. It also generates that output label list we talked about.
And the result is a modified HLS IP core.
Yep, an IP core with extra ports, 2 input streams now, data and incoming profile, and 2 output streams, process data and the outgoing accumulator profile.
And getting that onto the FPGA.
Since the surrounding system structure stays pretty similar, they use templates. Templates for the Vivato project setup, templates for the PYNQ Python scripts that control the accelerator and grab the data.
So the framework automatically wraps the profiled HLS core with these templates?
Exactly. And the amazing part is the whole thing from RIN definition script to getting profiling data back from the board is coordinated by a single command. That's what enables those large-scale experiments.
That level of automation is really impressive. Okay, but adding this whole parallel profiling stream must cost something in terms of FPGA resources, right? It can't be free.
Oh, absolutely not. They're very clear. The main overhead is that extra parallel data path for the profiling info. More registers, more routing.
Makes sense.
They also note that repeatedly reading and writing the profile data as it goes through each stage isn't super efficient. They suggest future work could look at bypassing stages where no monitoring happens, or maybe having intermediate collection points.
And what did the numbers look like in terms of LUTs, flip-flops, RAMs?
They looked at the Vivato implementation reports, comparing designs with and without profiling. Figure 3 shows the average overhead per signal you profile versus the total number of signals monitored concurrently.
Okay, I see. RAMs on the left axis, registers and LUTs on the right.
Yeah, this was for conv-TD stacks on the ZCU102. You can see how the overhead per signal changes as you monitor more things. They also played with the HLS formula reuse factor, which affects resource usage too.
And critically, how accurate was the profiling? Did adding all this stuff change the behavior they were trying to measure?
That's the million-dollar question, right? They compared the FIFO sizes from their onboard profiling with software co-simulation of the original design. For those conv-TD experiments in Figure 3, the max difference they saw was 6, and the average difference was tiny, like 0.997. The actual profile depths went from 1 up to 66. So it seems pretty accurate, not causing major distortions.
That's reassuring. They also looked at the bit width of the profiling stream itself, didn't they? How many bits they used to record at the FIFO size.
Yep, Figure 4 shows that. Overhead per signal versus profile stream bit width from 1 to 16 bits, again on the ZCU102, with 79 signals monitored.
And I guess more bits means more resources.
Generally, yeah. More bits need more BRAM, flip-flops, LETs, but they also found that for their specific FIFO sizes, going below 6 bits caused overflow. They couldn't actually represent the full range.
So there's a minimum precision needed, which then dictates a minimum resource cost, a trade-off.
Exactly. Precision versus resources.
Now, Table I in the paper compares COSIM, CSIM, and the profiled results. What came out of that? Were there discrepancies?
There were. Table I shows results for statistic RENN on ZCU102, 79 signals monitored. And yeah, sometimes the onboard profiled FIFO sizes were different from co-simulation.
Why might that be?
They think it might be some mutual interference. Remember the listing 2 showing that extra state machine logic for merging?
Yeah.
Adding that profiling logic even carefully might subtly change the timing or behavior of the original data path. It's that observer effect idea.
The act of measuring changes the thing being measured.
A little bit, perhaps. They suggest future work could try for finer control over the HDL generation in Vitas HLS to minimize this, or maybe use pragmas to embed profiling more tightly, like the RealProbe framework does for latency.
Did they mention power?
They did. For the RNN in Figure 4, with 16-bit profiling precision, the total power went up slightly from about 3.57W to 3.67W, so there's a small power cost too.
Okay, so minor impacts, but definitely something to be aware of. Let's shift to maybe the most interesting part for designers. The patterns they found in FIFO sizes across different RN strategies.
Yeah, this is where the systematic profiling really pays off. They varied everything. Network complexity, the target board, CCU 102 versus PY&Q, layer types, connection strategies, kernel sizes, filter sizes, that HLS formulate reuse factor, even data bit width.
And they looked at the maximum FIFO fullness observed on the board.
Exactly. They defined FIFO size in this context as the peak occupancy seen during actual hardware execution.
So starting with network complexity, did making the RNs bigger or smaller change the FIFO patterns drastically?
Surprisingly, not always. They saw certain specific FIFO depths popping up again and again, especially in the conv layers, regardless of the overall RNN complexity.
Like specific numbers?
Yeah, like a depth of 29 in the first conv layer, the one with shape X by 1, showed up consistently. Depths of 18, 12, and 9 were common in other conv layers. Even the add layers showed recurring patterns. Figure 5 graphs some of this, showing FIFO fullness distributions for different complexities on both boards.
That's fascinating, almost like hardware signatures for certain operations. What about the different FPGA boards, ZCU 102 versus the PY&Q Z2?
They ran the same RNN on both. Many of the same characteristic FIFO depths appeared, which is interesting. But there were subtle differences.
Why?
They suspect it's down to slight differences in the HTL code generated by Vitas HLS when targeting different architectures. For instance, the final dense layers matrix multiply got an extra output buffer register on the PY&Q, but not the ZCU 102.
So even from the same HLS code, the target device matters for the nitty-gritty implementation details.
Definitely. A crucial point if you're targeting multiple platforms.
And the type of layers, we touched on this, convoy layers versus simpler ones.
Huge difference. Remember those RINNs with only dense, add, ReLU, etc.? Max FIFO size profiled was 0 or 1. Compare that to the much larger, varied sizes in the conv RINNs, like 29, 18, 12, 9. It strongly suggests the layer type and its HLS implementation are major drivers of buffering needs.
What about the connection patterns within the RINNs, short versus long connections?
Their initial look suggested long-distance skip connections tended to result in larger FIFO sizes, especially for add operations where data from different latency paths comes together. Makes sense to need more buffering to sync things up.
Okay, and within a conv2D layer itself, kernel size.
Generally, larger kernels, they tested 2x2 up to 6x6, seem to lead to larger FIFO sizes in those conv layers. Again, intuitive bigger kernel processes, more data at once, needs more internal buffering.
What about the number of filters or output channels?
Less impact, surprisingly. Varying filter count, 2 to 10, didn't change FIFO utilization much. Maybe some minor decreases sometimes, but kernel size seemed more dominant.
And the HLS 4mm reuse factor, that controls hardware sharing.
That definitely influenced FIFO sizes, as shown in Figure 5. But the trend wasn't simple or linear. Higher reuse saves area but changes throughput, affecting FIFO dynamics in complex ways. Needs more study, they said.
Lastly, data precision, the bit width of the actual numbers being computed.
Generally limited impact on maximum FIFO utilization in their tests. They saw one case where an add FIFO went from size 9 to 10 when going from 8-bit to 16-bit data, but mostly it wasn't a major factor for peak FIFO size.
So after all that, they managed to boil it down into some practical advice for designers trying to size their FIFOs initially.
Yeah, they proposed a kind of starting strategy based on these observations.
That's the gist.
Okay, so minimize data bit width and filter size if you can, as they don't seem to hurt FIFO size much. Maximize the reuse factor for area savings. Keep kernel size as needed for function. Then, use a small randomly connected RINN as a quick test case to find the likely FIFO size hotspots or candidates for your layer types.
Like a probe.
Exactly. And finally, be ready to give larger FIFOs to those long-distance connections in your network as they seem to need more buffering. It's preliminary, but provides some useful starting points.
That's incredibly valuable. It turns profiling from just debugging into something that can inform design choices early on. Okay, let's wrap this up. Can you summarize the key takeaways, the main contributions of this spring paper?
Sure. I think there are three big things. First, the novel HLS level profiling framework itself, that parallel profiling stream idea for systematically monitoring lots of internal signals focused on FIFO size. That's new.
Right.
Second, the tight integration with HLS formility, enabling this automated large-scale benchmarking of complex designs like RINNs. That automation is huge for research and practical development. And third, the initial analysis and insights into how neural network architecture patterns, layer types, connections, parameters actually influence FIFO behavior on FPGAs. That gives designers concrete, if preliminary, guidance.
And they were upfront about limitations in future work, too.
Yeah, they acknowledge that for some metrics, like absolute max FIFO depth over a whole run, you still need to embed custom logic. And the number of samples per signal is static right now.
What's next for them?
Lots of plans.
Yeah.
Optimizing the profiling stream itself, those shortcuts, minimizing buffering, simplifying the profiling logic insertion, maybe using pragmas or dedicated HDL modules, reducing the resource overhead and interference further.
And expanding the metrics.
Exactly. Moving beyond just FIFO fullness to capture latency, internal runtime states. Things that give even deeper insight into how these ML models behave in hardware, maybe even helping ensure safer operation.
This really feels like it's pushing towards a much deeper understanding of FPGA accelerators, beyond just does it work, into how well does it really work and why.
Totally agree. It's about performance characterization.
So, final thought for our listeners to ponder. Given those device-specific differences, they saw the ZCU 102 behaving slightly differently from the PY&Q, even with the same HLS code. How might future HLS tools actually start incorporating more device-aware profiling and optimization? It seems like the specific FPGA target matters more than maybe we always account for at the HLS level.
That's a great question to end on. How do we make HLS truly target-aware in terms of these subtle performance behaviors? Bridging that gap is going to be fascinating to watch.
Absolutely. Well, that was our deep dive into Spring, systematic profiling of randomly interconnected neural networks generated by HLS. Fantastic insights. Thanks so much for breaking it down.
My pleasure. Really interesting paper.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in to the deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.